Welcome. And thank you for joining me here on this channel, on this podcast. We talk about your inner science, meditation. So, in this brief meditative note, we have a question. How old is meditation? I encourage you to go back and do a little homework and research for yourself. How old is meditation? Now, meditation is a very old human practice, but this is a very brief highlight only because the subject is so vast. This is why it's important that you go back to do a little study on meditation. How old is meditation? Do a little study for yourself. First, let's look at the word meditation. Let's go to the root meaning. Etymology. Etymology means going to the root meaning of a word. So let's do that right now. The English word comes from the Latin meditatio and meditare, which means to think, reflect, contemplate, or practice mentally. Now, if you were sitting in ancient Kemet, just as she's doing, we have this stick figure here who's sitting in ancient Kemet. They would not have used the English word meditation. The same is true in ancient India. When you learn about different ancient civilizations and their own spiritual traditions, China, Japan, throughout many different ancient civilizations, they did not use the English word meditation, but it does not mean they had no meditation practice. It simply means the practice is older than the modern word. Again, the practice is older than the modern word. Also, much of early spiritual life, spiritual traditions, were passed down through oral tradition. So the practice often came before the written record. So when our ancestors migrated out of Africa into different parts of the world, they migrated out of Africa and they went into what we become known as India. They went into what become known as China. They went into what become known as Japan. They went into what would become known as the Philippines. They went into what become known as North America, Alaska, Hawaii, Mexico, Europe. So they migrated out of Africa. And when they migrated out of Africa, they didn't leave that spiritual science, their spiritual tradition there. No, they brought it with them. They carried their oral traditions with them. And that's important as we take a brief glimpse at meditation. How old is meditation? So again, much of early spiritual life was passed down through oral tradition. So the practice often came before the written record. If you go back thousands of years, the earliest strong written evidence for meditation-like practices came from ancient India. The Indian subcontinent had human populations long before written history. But settlement history is not the same thing as evidence for meditation. What scholars can point to more clearly are the Vedas, where we see early ideas of inward focus, breath awareness, discipline of the mind, and withdrawal of attention from outer distractions. But you also find this in early ancient civilizations. This is incorporated in their spiritual traditions. In ancient Kemet, also known as ancient Egypt, as an example, they did not leave behind a modern category called meditation, but they did practice ritual focus, withdrawal of attention from outer distractions, sacred recitation, breath awareness, inward focus, silence, a time of stillness, Heka. Heka was the power of the words, the spoken word, contemplative temple work. Priests and initiates and the priestess sought alignment with Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Ma'at, the goddess Ma'at, represented and symbolized truth, harmony, balance, order. So while the word is modern, the inner discipline is ancient. In China, early Taoist traditions developed breath cultivation, stillness, and quiet inward practice. And later Buddhist meditation also became important in China, in other parts of Asia. In Japan, meditation became especially associated with Zen Buddhism, especially seated meditation. But again, the practice evolved over time and was adapted into local spiritual culture. And this is something, again, that you find in ancient spiritual traditions in different cultures, where the practice, it changes over time. You have invasions, you have colonization, where the cultures are influenced by the invader, by colonization, by enslavement. And before colonization and enslavement, many traditional systems across Africa, Asia, and the Americas had forms of contemplative practice. Before what would become known as America was invaded, was colonized, the original inhabitants, the indigenous people, had their own spiritual tradition of contemplation, connecting with nature. So they had their own forms of contemplative practice, chanting, breath regulation, ritual silence, what become known as the term prayer, drumming, attention to nature, and inward reflection. They may not have called it meditation, but they were clearly practicing forms of focused awareness. So, how old is meditation? The most honest answer for this is meditation is older than the word itself. Meditation is older than the word itself, older than many written texts, and likely as old as humanity's search to steady the mind, understand suffering, and connect with something deeper. So when we take a look at ancient spiritual traditions, we have to go back to the practice. The practice often came before the written record. Again, I encourage you to go back and do a little homework and study for yourself. That's really important. And thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. I hope you found this helpful. And if you can share your thoughts in the comment section, if this is something that you're learning more about, you're checking out a book at your local library, your local bookstore, as you're on your journey of connecting with your inner spiritual science, on your journey of inner realization.